In the warm, saturated glow of late 90s television, some faces felt like friends. They were fixtures in our living rooms, their weekly appearances a comfortable rhythm in a world on the brink of a new millennium. They were the laugh track, the familiar storyline, the comforting resolution at the end of a long day. On NBC's hit sitcom, Suddenly Susan, a show built around the megawatt star power of Brooke Shields, one of those faces belonged to David Strickland. As the boyish, endearingly awkward music critic Todd Stites, he was the quirky heart of the ensemble. His energy was a blend of wide-eyed innocence and a kind of nervous, vibrating wit that felt entirely genuine. He was the office kid brother, the lovable goofball, whose lines were delivered with a distinctive, infectious rhythm. But behind the bright lights of the soundstage and the canned laughter of a studio audience, a very different story was unfolding. It was a story of immense talent and profound struggle, of a brilliant mind battling a relentless illness, and of a life that was heading towards a devastatingly quiet, final act in a place designed for noise and spectacle, Las Vegas. This is the story of a man you thought you knew, a story of the fragile line between the characters we play and the people we are, and the heartbreaking reality that sometimes the brightest smiles hide the deepest pain. To understand David Strickland's journey, one must first step back into the cultural landscape of the 1990s. It was a unique and often contradictory decade, a period of immense prosperity and simmering anxieties. The internet was just beginning to thread its way into the fabric of daily life, yet television remained the undisputed king of popular culture. For actors, the pinnacle of success wasn't a viral video or a global streaming hit. It was a spot on a primetime network sitcom. Shows like Friends, Seinfeld, and Frasier didn't just dominate the ratings, they defined the cultural conversation. Landing a role on a Thursday night must-see TV lineup was akin to winning the lottery. It meant fame, financial security, and a level of public recognition that was both powerful and intensely demanding. He was a face familiar to millions, a rising star on a hit sitcom, a man whose on-screen persona was one of goofy, boyish charm. His name was David Strickland, and in the early morning hours of March 22, 1999, he would end his story in a cheap room at the Oasis Motel, just a stone's throw from the glitz of the Las Vegas Strip. He was 29 years old. To the public, it was a sudden, incomprehensible tragedy, a life full of promise, cut short in the most brutal way. But for those who knew him, for those who saw past the easy smile and the quick laugh, it was the culmination of a desperate, silent war that had been raging for years, a war against an illness that was as relentless as it was invisible. This isn't just the story of a celebrity's tragic death. It's the story of a deeply sensitive and troubled soul, a man beloved by his friends, who found himself trapped in a battle he could no longer fight. It's a story about the shadows that can gather behind the brightest of spotlights and the devastating cost of a pain that the world couldn't see. David Gordon Strickland was born on October 14, 1969, in Glen Cove, Long Island, a suburban enclave of New York. His early life was not one of Hollywood glamour, but of quiet, middle-class normalcy. His father, Gordon, was an executive, and his mother, Karen, a homemaker. Along with his two sisters, David grew up in a world that seemed stable and secure. However, from a young age, there were signs that David was wired differently. He was described as a sensitive and intensely creative child, with a mind that seemed to work at a different speed from those around him. This creativity manifested as a love for performance. He was the kid who could always make his friends laugh, the one who would readily jump into character, finding an outlet for his racing thoughts in the world of make-believe. The family eventually relocated to Pacific Palisades, a wealthy neighborhood in Los Angeles, a move that would inadvertently place the young, impressionable David at the doorstep of the entertainment industry. It was here, in the sun-drenched, competitive environment of Southern California, that his passion for acting began to truly take shape. After graduating from high school, he didn't follow a traditional path to college or a steady career. Instead, he threw himself into the world of theater. He became a member of a local theater company, honing his craft not in sterile classrooms, but on dusty stages in front of small, intimate audiences. This was where he felt most at home, in the collaborative, slightly chaotic world of live performance. It was during this formative period that he met people who would become his lifelong friends, including the actor and comedian Andy Dick. They were part of a tribe of young, hungry artists, all trying to find their footing, sharing dreams and anxieties in equal measure. Friends from this era remember David not just for his comedic talent, but for his incredible generosity and loyalty. He was the guy who would give you his last $20, the one who would show up at 3 a.m. to help you work through a problem. There was a kindness to him, a genuine sweetness that drew people in. But alongside this warmth, the seeds of his later struggles were already beginning to sprout. Even in these early days, friends noticed his tendency towards extreme moods. He could be brilliantly energetic and funny one moment, and then plummet into a quiet, brooding melancholy the next. At the time, it was often dismissed as the typical angst of a struggling artist, the emotional roller coaster that came with the territory of chasing an uncertain dream. No one yet had a name for it. No one understood that these dramatic swings were not just part of his personality, but symptoms of a serious underlying condition: bipolar disorder. His professional life began to gain traction with a series of small guest roles on popular television shows of the time, like Dave's World and Roseanne. He was building a resume, getting his face out there. But his big break, the role that would catapult him from a struggling actor to a household name, came in 1996. He was cast as Todd, the goofy punk rock loving music critic on the NBC sitcom Suddenly Susan, starring alongside Brooke Shields. The show was an instant hit. It was part of NBC's powerhouse must-see TV lineup, airing on Thursday nights to massive audiences. As Todd, David was an immediate standout. With his spiky hair, sarcastic wit, and an underlying sweetness, he brought a unique, chaotic energy to the ensemble. He was the lovable oddball, the perfect foil to the more grounded characters around him. The role seemed tailor-made for him, allowing him to showcase his natural comedic timing and his quirky, boyish charm. To the millions of viewers who tuned in each week, David Strickland was the funny guy from TV, a picture of youthful success and carefree humor. Behind the scenes, however, a very different story was unfolding. The pressures of newfound fame were immense. Suddenly, he was recognizable everywhere he went. His life was no longer his own. For someone with a pre-existing, and at this point still undiagnosed mental illness, this constant scrutiny was like pouring gasoline on a fire. His mood swings became more pronounced, his behavior more erratic. His friends and castmates on Suddenly Susan became his surrogate family, and they were the first to witness the true depth of his struggle. Brooke Shields, in particular, developed a close, almost maternal bond with him. She saw both his incredible talent and his profound vulnerability. She and the other cast members, including Kathy Griffin and Judd Nelson, often found themselves trying to support him, to create a safe and stable environment on set. They knew he was struggling, but the nature of his illness made it incredibly difficult to manage. He had days where he was the life of the party, improvising hilarious lines and keeping everyone in stitches. On other days, he would arrive on set withdrawn and despondent, unable to connect, the light in his eyes dimmed by a sadness no one could quite reach. It was during this period that his struggles with substance abuse also escalated. Like so many who suffer from bipolar disorder, David began to self-medicate, using drugs and alcohol in a desperate attempt to regulate his chaotic moods. When he was in a manic phase, feeling invincible and full of racing energy, substances helped him feel a sense of release. When he was in a depressive phase, mired in a pit of despair, they offered a temporary, albeit dangerous, numbness. This created a vicious cycle. The substance abuse would exacerbate his mental health issues, and the worsening mental health issues would drive him deeper into addiction. His personal life became a casualty of this internal chaos. He had a long-term relationship with actress Tiffany Thiessen, a romance that played out under the watchful eye of the tabloids. But his unpredictable behavior and escalating problems put an immense strain on the relationship, and it eventually ended. He was a man who craved connection and stability, yet his own illness made it nearly impossible to maintain. One of the most revealing and rarely discussed incidents from this time involves his increasingly erratic behavior away from the set. There were reports of him getting into altercations, of disappearing for days at a time, leaving his friends and colleagues frantic with worry. On one occasion, he reportedly had a manic episode in public, leading to a confrontation that nearly turned violent. These weren't the actions of a bad boy actor enjoying the spoils of fame. They were the desperate cries for help from a man who was losing control. His friends did what they could. They tried to get him into treatment. They confronted him about his drug use. They offered him unconditional support. But bipolar disorder is a cunning and powerful disease. It whispers lies to its victims, telling them they don't need help, that they can handle it on their own, that no one understands what they're going through. In the fall of 1998, his struggles came to a head in a very public way. He was arrested for possession of cocaine. The arrest was a major wake-up call, not just for David, but for everyone around him. The secret was out. The carefully constructed image of the happy-go-lucky sitcom star was shattered. As a result of the arrest, he was ordered by the court to enter rehab and was placed on probation. For a brief period, it seemed like this might be the turning point. He entered a treatment facility, and for a while things seemed to stabilize. He was reportedly committed to his recovery, attending meetings and therapy sessions. His castmates on Suddenly Susan were incredibly supportive, even adjusting production schedules to accommodate his treatment. They were rooting for him, desperate to see him win his battle. However, the period following his rehab stint was fraught with difficulty. While he was now officially diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was prescribed medication, including lithium, to help manage his condition, he was inconsistent with his treatment. This is a common and tragic aspect of the illness. When the medication works and the mood stabilize, patients can sometimes feel cured and believe they no longer need it. Others dislike the side effects, which can make them feel emotionally blunted, a particularly difficult thing for a creative person to accept. David reportedly complained that the lithium stifled his creativity, that it robbed him of the very spark that made him a good actor. He was trapped in an impossible paradox. The very thing that might save his life felt like it was killing his soul. In the weeks leading up to his death, his behavior became increasingly alarming. He had reportedly stopped taking his medication and had relapsed into drug and alcohol use. His friends and family were deeply concerned. He seemed to be in the grip of a severe depressive episode, mixed with moments of frantic, manic energy. He was making dark jokes about suicide, comments that his friends tried to dismiss as his morbid sense of humor, but which in retrospect were clear and chilling red flags. On the weekend of March 20th, 1999, David Strickland, along with his friend, the comedian Andy Dick, flew from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. The exact purpose of the trip remains somewhat murky. By some accounts, it was meant to be a weekend of blowing off steam. By others, it was clear that David was in a state of profound distress. He was reportedly on a multi-day bender, consuming large amounts of alcohol and allegedly using drugs. His behavior was erratic, even by his standards. He was reportedly fixated on the death of the musician, Phil Hartman, who had been tragically killed by his wife in a murder-suicide the previous year. He was also said to be deeply upset about his ongoing legal troubles and the potential impact on his career. He felt like his life was spiraling out of control, that he had disappointed everyone who cared about him. The last night of his life was spent in a blur of activity that painted a picture of a man in deep turmoil. He and Andy Dick reportedly went to a strip club, the Gigi's Glitter Gulch, where David was seen drinking heavily. Eyewitnesses from that night would later recount his behavior as being both agitated and deeply sad. There was a desperation about him. At some point during the evening, he and Andy Dick had a falling out. The details of their argument are not public, but it resulted in Andy Dick leaving and flying back to Los Angeles, leaving David alone in Las Vegas. This is a detail that is often overlooked, but is of immense emotional significance. In his final desperate hours, David Strickland was utterly alone. The friend he had traveled with was gone. He was in a city of strangers, a place designed for anonymity and transient encounters. After leaving the strip club, he checked into the Oasis Motel. It was not a glamorous high-end resort on the Strip. It was a cheap, hourly rate motel, a place of last resort for those on the fringes. He paid for the room in cash, using the name Peter Michaels. He was trying to disappear. What happened in that room in the early morning hours of March 22nd is a scene of profound and quiet tragedy. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final angry outburst. There was just a man, alone with his demons, who had reached the end of his rope. He reportedly consumed a 6-pack of beer. He then took a bedsheet, tied it around his neck, and hanged himself from a beam in the ceiling. His body was discovered later that morning by a motel employee who had been sent to check on the room. The news of his death sent a shockwave through Hollywood and beyond. It was a story that seemed to defy logic. How could this funny, successful young man, who brought so much laughter to others, be in so much pain? For his castmates on Suddenly Susan, the news was utterly devastating. They had known he was struggling, but no one had believed it would end this way. Brooke Shields, in a statement, described her overwhelming grief, calling David a dear, dear friend. Kathy Griffin would later speak about the immense guilt and sadness felt by the cast, the endless what-ifs that haunt those left behind after a suicide. What if they had done more? What if they had seen the signs more clearly? The show, Suddenly Susan, was forced to confront the tragedy head-on. In a move that was both brave and heartbreaking, the writers decided to write David's death into the show. In the season 3 finale, his character, Todd, also dies unexpectedly. The episode, titled A Day in the Life, serves as a tribute to both the character and the actor. The other characters spend the episode reminiscing about Todd, sharing stories of his kindness and his eccentricities. The final scenes, in which the cast breaks character and speaks directly to the audience about their love for David, are almost unbearably poignant. It's a raw, unfiltered expression of grief, a television show momentarily shedding its artifice to reveal the very real human tragedy behind the screen, it remains one of the most powerful and unusual moments in sitcom history. The controversy and historical debate surrounding David Strickland's death do not involve conspiracies or hidden agendas. Instead, they center on the deeply complex and often misunderstood nature of mental illness and addiction. In the immediate aftermath of his death, there was, as there often is in these cases, a search for a single, simple reason. Some tabloid reports tried to sensationalize the story, focusing on the drugs, the strip club, and the final argument with Andy Dick. They painted a picture of a wild, out-of-control party boy whose lifestyle finally caught up with him. But this interpretation is a gross oversimplification. It ignores the central, driving force behind the tragedy: David Strickland's bipolar disorder. His substance abuse was not the cause of his problems, but a symptom of his desperate attempt to cope with them. The controversies, then, are more subtle and profound. They involve our societal understanding of mental health, especially in the late 1990s. At the time, while awareness was growing, there was still a significant stigma attached to mental illness. For a man in the public eye, admitting to such a struggle was seen as a career risk. There was a fear of being labeled as difficult or unreliable. David himself was reportedly torn between seeking help and trying to maintain the facade of the successful, well-adjusted actor. There is also the ongoing debate about the role of the people around him. Andy Dick, in particular, faced a great deal of public scrutiny and in some quarters blame. He was the last person to be with David, and he left him alone. In the years since, Andy Dick has spoken openly about that night and his own struggles with addiction. He has expressed profound regret and sorrow, stating, "I'll never get over it." But to lay the blame at his feet is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of suicide. Suicide is the result of an illness that convinces the sufferer that death is the only escape from an unbearable pain. While the actions of others can have an impact, the final tragic decision rests with the individual who is in the grips of that illness. The historical significance of David Strickland's story is multifaceted. On one level, it serves as a tragic but powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated mental illness. His death, along with others of that era, helped to bring the issue of bipolar disorder and its connection to suicide into the public consciousness. It forced a conversation not just in Hollywood, but in homes across the country about the reality of these diseases. It highlighted the fact that mental illness does not discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of their fame, success, or outward appearance. His story also sheds light on the immense pressures of celebrity culture. We, as an audience, often consume the lives of famous people as a form of entertainment. We see the polished images on screen, the smiling faces on red carpets, and we assume that this is the whole picture. David's story is a stark reminder of the human being behind the public persona, a reminder that fame can be an incredibly isolating and destructive force, especially for someone who is already vulnerable. It forces us to question our own relationship with celebrity and the often unrealistic expectations we place on public figures. More than 2 decades after his death, what endures is the memory of a man who was, by all accounts, deeply loved. The stories told by his friends are not about a troubled celebrity, but about a kind, funny, and generous person who was fighting a battle that was bigger than him. Judd Nelson, his Suddenly Susan co-star, once shared a poignant memory that speaks volumes about David's character. He recalled how, on set, David was always looking out for others. If someone seemed down, he would be the first to try and cheer them up, to crack a joke, to offer a word of encouragement. He was in many ways a healer who could not heal himself. This is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking contradictions of his life. His immense capacity for empathy and his inability to turn that same compassion inward. In a rarely seen interview clip from shortly before his death, David was asked about his plans for the future. He spoke with a kind of weary optimism, talking about his desire to do more theater, to write, to continue to grow as an artist. There was a hope in his voice, a glimpse of the man he wanted to be, the life he wanted to live. But there was also a shadow in his eyes, a flicker of the immense pain he was carrying. It's a clip that is almost impossible to watch without a sense of profound sadness for what was lost. In the end, the story of David Strickland is not just about a suicide in a Las Vegas motel room. It's a deeply human story about the fragility of the mind and the devastating power of an illness that thrives in silence and shame. It's about the beautiful, complicated, and ultimately tragic life of a man who made millions of people laugh while he himself was silently crying for help. He was more than just Todd from Suddenly Susan, more than just another Hollywood casualty. He was a son, a brother, a beloved friend, a talented artist whose light was extinguished far too soon. His legacy is a somber but vital reminder to look past the easy smiles and the public faces, to listen for the silent screams, and to meet those who are struggling not with judgment, but with the kind of compassion and understanding that David himself so readily gave to others, but could never quite find for himself. His story compels us to be kinder, to be more aware, and to remember that sometimes the people who bring the most light to the world are the ones who are secretly living in the darkest of shadows. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.